The auditorium smelled of old wood and forgotten promises. David Sanders stood in the wings, his calloused fingers wrapped around the neck of his guitar. A 1967 Gibson J45 that had belonged to his father, then his grandfather before that. The instrument bore the scars of 3 generations. A cigarette burn near the sound hole from his grandfather's late nights in smoky bars. A crack along the body that his father had meticulously repaired with wood glue and prayer, and now David's own marks. Pick scratches that formed constellations across the pickguard, each one a song, each one a moment he tried to capture and hold. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. The Riverside Community Center's annual charity gala was meant for donors in tailored suits and women in evening gowns who smelled of perfume that cost more than his monthly rent. They came to write checks, sip wine from plastic cups masquerading as crystal, and feel good about themselves for exactly 3 hours before returning to their gated communities on the hill. David had been hired as background music, the kind that shouldn't be noticed, shouldn't interrupt conversations about tax deductions and foundation grants. $50 for 2 hours of playing. He'd learned not to expect applause, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way the stage lights caught the dust motes, making them dance like snow in reverse. Maybe it was the woman in the 3rd row, the one with silver hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, who kept glancing at her phone with the kind of urgency that suggested someone, somewhere, was dying or being born. Or maybe it was Marcus, the janitor who'd let David in through the back entrance, who'd said something strange as he'd unlocked the door. Play like they're listening, even when they ain't, especially when they ain't. Marcus was 67, with hands that trembled from decades of holding mops and brooms, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He'd worked at the Riverside Community Center for 42 years, since back when it was actually a community center and not just a venue rich people rented for events that made them feel charitable. He knew every water stain on the ceiling, every loose floorboard, every secret the building held. And he knew David, had known him since David was 8 years old and came here for free music lessons in the basement, back when the center still offered them. "You remember Miss Chan?" Marcus had asked, holding the door open against the November wind that carried the smell of coming rain. David had nodded. Of course he remembered Miss Chun. She taught him his first chords, had shown him how to hold a pick, had told him that music wasn't about the notes you played but the silence between them. She died 3 years ago, and the free music program had died with her. Budget cuts, they'd said. Reallocation of resources, which was a fancy way of saying that poor kids no longer deserved to learn how to make beauty. She used to say something, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, said that charity was what people gave when they wanted to feel good. But justice was what you gave because you knew the world was wrong and you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't try to make it right. Now, standing in the wings with his guitar, David thought about that distinction. The program for tonight's event sat on a nearby chair, and he'd read it 3 times while waiting for his slot. The Riverside Foundation Annual Charity Gala, benefiting local arts programs. Except there were no local arts programs anymore. The free music lessons had ended. The after-school theater program had been shuttered. The painting classes for seniors had been canceled. Where was the money going? Who was being helped? A woman strode past him, her heels clicking against the wooden floor with the rhythm of a metronome set too fast. She wore a name tag that read Vanessa Cromwell, Foundation Director, and carried a clipboard like a weapon. She didn't look at David, didn't acknowledge his existence. To her, he was part of the furniture, as necessary and as invisible as the sound system or the lighting rig. 5 minutes, she said to someone on her headset. Then we bring out the scholarship recipients. Make sure they look, grateful. David's stomach twisted. He'd seen the scholarship recipients in the hallway, 3 teenagers in clothes that were clearly borrowed, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and discomfort. One of them, a girl with box braids and a violin case covered in stickers, had been crying in the bathroom earlier. David had heard her through the door, talking to someone on the phone. "I know, Mama. I know it's a lot of money, But they keep asking me questions about Dad being in prison, and I don't know what they want me to say. Like, is my trauma entertaining enough? Is my suffering worth their check? He'd walked away before he could hear more, shame burning in his chest, not for her, but for everyone else, for the system that demanded pain as payment for opportunity. The Gibson felt heavier in his hands than usual. His set list was safe: Blackbird by the Beatles, Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, maybe Hallelujah, if he was feeling particularly invisible. Songs that had been worn smooth by a million other guitarists, songs that wouldn't challenge anyone or make them think too hard about the lyrics. But his fingers found different chords, muscle memory pulling up something older, rawer. A song his father had written called The Price of Giving. David had been 12 when he'd first heard it, sitting on the porch of their apartment while his father worked through the melody, changing it, refining it, never quite satisfied. The song was about a mill owner who donated a playground to the town while paying his workers poverty wages. He wanted a statue, his father had sung, wanted his name on a plaque, but the children playing on the swings, they're too hungry to swing back. His father had never performed it publicly, said it was too angry, too political, said it would close doors that were already barely cracked open for a black musician trying to make a living in a town that preferred its entertainment palatable and its politics unspoken. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his sister, Teresa. "Remember, you need this gig. Don't do anything stupid." Teresa was a nurse at County General, working double shifts to support her 2 kids after her husband had left. She was practical, pragmatic, the one who'd convinced David to take this gig in the first place, even though they both knew it was a performance of poverty for the rich. $50 is $50, she'd said, and they're not going to listen anyway, so take their money and go home. But Marcus's words echoed, "Play like they're listening, even when they ain't." The woman with the silver hair in the 3rd row put her phone away and looked up at the stage, and for just a moment, her eyes met David's. There was something in her expression. Recognition? Expectation? A challenge? The stage manager, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Robert, appeared at David's elbow. "You're on in 2. Remember, keep it light. Nothing too much." "Too much of what?" David asked, though he knew the answer. Robert just gave him a look that said everything. Too real. Too honest. Too anything that might make the donors uncomfortable while they were writing checks that would mostly pay for Vanessa Cromwell's salary and this building's maintenance while actual artists and kids who needed help got crumbs, if they were lucky. David walked onto the stage, and the scattered conversations in the audience continued without pause. 150 people in formal wear, holding drinks, networking, performing their own version of charity. The lights were warm on his face, and he adjusted the microphone stand, his guitar strap settling into the familiar groove on his shoulder. "Good evening," he said, and maybe a dozen people glanced his way before returning to their conversations. "My name is David Sanders, and I'm here to play a few songs while you enjoy the evening." He started with Blackbird, because it was expected, because it was safe. His fingers moved through the picking pattern that he could play in his sleep, and the song filled the space between conversations, pleasant and unobtrusive. A woman near the back laughed at something her companion said, the sound cutting through the delicate melody. David kept playing. But as the song ended, as the final note faded into the acoustic space of the old auditorium, something shifted in him. He thought of the girl crying in the bathroom, of Marcus holding the door open in the cold, of Miss Chun who had believed that every child deserved beauty in their life not as charity but as a right. He thought of his father's unperformed song, of all the words that had been swallowed and silenced in the name of not making waves, not causing trouble, not being too much. His fingers found the opening chords of The Price of Giving. From the wings, he could see Marcus, who had stopped sweeping and stood still, recognition dawning on his face. He could see Robert's expression shifting from bored supervision to sudden concern. And he could see the woman with the silver hair in the third row lean forward, her attention finally, fully, locked on the stage. David opened his mouth and began to sing his father's words, words about charity that wasn't charity at all, about giving that was really taking, about foundations built on the backs of the broken while claiming to help them stand. His voice was rough around the edges, not polished like a professional, but true in a way that cut through the polite murmur of the room. And slowly, impossibly, the conversations began to die down. People turned to look. The song built, verse by verse, each one another indictment wrapped in melody. He sang about board members who voted themselves bonuses while cutting programs for kids. He sang about galas that cost more to throw than they raised for causes. He sang about the mathematics of exploitation disguised as philanthropy. Vanessa Cromwell appeared in his peripheral vision, her face a mask of fury, making cutting motions with her hand. Stop. Stop now. But David kept playing, kept singing, because stopping now would be a betrayal of everyone who'd been silenced before him, of his father who'd written these words but never had the courage to share them, of the girl with the violin case who'd had to perform her pain for pocket change. The final chord rang out in a room that had gone completely, utterly silent. For 3 heartbeats, nothing. No applause. No sound at all except David's own breathing and the whisper of the ventilation system. Then the woman with the silver hair stood up. She was clapping, slowly, deliberately, each impact of her palms together like a pronouncement. Others remained seated, frozen, uncertain. Vanessa Cromwell was making her way toward the stage, her face twisted with rage. But the woman kept clapping, and she was speaking now, her voice carrying across the hushed room. That was remarkable, absolutely remarkable, because you just sang the truth about this organization, about what we've become, and I should know, I helped found it 40 years ago. David's hands went still on the guitar strings. The auditorium felt larger suddenly, the air thinner. My name is Dorothy Keene, the woman continued, and I'm on the board of the Riverside Foundation, or at least I was, until about 3 minutes ago when I decided to start asking questions I should have been asking years ago. Young man, do you know where the money raised tonight is actually going? David shook his head, his voice lost somewhere in his chest. Dorothy Keene smiled, but it was a smile edged with something sharp and dangerous. Neither do I. Not anymore. But I think it's time we all found out. David's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had given up on elegance sometime in the 1970s. The stairs creaked with the weight of decades, and the hallway always smelled like Mrs. Patterson's cooking from 3B, usually something with onions and hope. He'd lived here for 6 years. Ever since he'd aged out of the halfway decent apartment, he'd shared with 3 other musicians who'd all eventually gotten real jobs or moved back home or given up on the dream entirely. The dream. David wasn't even sure what that was anymore. When he was younger, when his father was still alive, the dream had been clear. Make music that mattered, reach people, say something true. But truth didn't pay rent. Truth didn't keep the lights on. Truth had gotten his father exactly nowhere except an early grave and a garage full of recordings that no one would ever hear. He set his guitar case down by the door. Never against the wall, his father had taught him, because temperature changes and humidity could warp the wood. The case itself was held together with duct tape and hope, the latches replaced twice, the handle worn smooth from carrying. Inside, tucked into the accessory pocket, was the check from tonight's gig. $50 made out to David L. Sanders. The L stood for Lawrence, after his grandfather, the one who'd first brought the Gibson home from a pawn shop in Memphis in 1969. He should have been exhausted, but his hands were still shaking with adrenaline. After Dorothy Keene's pronouncement, everything had descended into controlled chaos. Vanessa Cromwell had tried to salvage the evening, her voice pitched high with forced cheerfulness as she'd thanked David for his passionate performance and ushered him off the stage. But the damage was done, or maybe the healing had begun. It was hard to tell the difference in the moment. Marcus had found him in the hallway afterward, pressed a piece of paper into his hand with a phone number. "Ms. Keene wants to talk to you," he'd said. "Tomorrow." "She's serious, David. I've known that woman for 40 years, and when she gets that look in her eye, mountains move." Now, alone in his apartment, David unfolded the paper and stared at the number. The handwriting was precise, controlled, the numbers formed with the kind of penmanship they didn't teach anymore. Below the number, a note. "You asked a question with your music. I'd like to help you find the answer. DK." His phone rang, and he nearly dropped the paper. Teresa's name flashed on the screen. "Tell me you didn't," she said without preamble. David sank onto his couch, which was actually just a futon he'd found on the curb, and reupholstered himself. "Didn't what?" "Don't play dumb with me, David. I got a call from Lydia Chen. You remember her, Ms. Chen's daughter? She was at that gala tonight for work. She said you performed some protest song and basically accused the foundation of corruption in front of all their donors. I played a song Dad wrote." Silence on the other end. Then softer, "Oh, David. It was the truth, Teresa. You should see where that money's going, or not going, more accurately. The programs are all gone. The kids have nothing. But the foundation's still raising hundreds of thousands of dollars every year." "For what?" "For things that aren't your problem," Teresa said. But there was less conviction in her voice now. "Look, I know you want to make a difference. I know you're angry about Dad, about how hard he worked and how little he got for it. But this isn't the way. You can't just what? Tell the truth? Sing a song. You can't just throw away opportunities because you're mad at the world. You need work, David. Real work. The session gigs are drying up. You haven't booked a solo show in months. And I know for a fact you're 3 weeks behind on rent, because Mrs. Patterson told me she saw the notice on your door." Shame heated David's face. Mrs. Patterson, with her kind eyes and her nosiness that came from a place of genuine care, had probably told half the building about his financial situation. And Teresa, working herself to exhaustion to keep her own family afloat, didn't need to be worrying about her baby brother. "I'll figure it out," he said. "You always say that. And you always do somehow, but David, you're 34 years old. At some point, figuring it out needs to look like stability. Health insurance, a retirement account, a life that isn't just scraping by from one gig to the next." "Dad scraped by his whole life," David said quietly. "He died scraping by, and you know what he left behind? Beauty, music, things that mattered. He also left behind a family that struggled," Teresa countered. "Mom had to work 2 jobs after he died. You and I both learned what poverty felt like. Real poverty, the kind where you're eating cereal for dinner and hoping the electricity doesn't get shut off. Is that the legacy you want? Nobility and hunger." David stood and walked to the window. His apartment overlooked an alley where Mr. Kowalski from the building next door kept his sad little garden in containers. Tomatoes in summer, herbs in spring. Right now just empty pots waiting for warmth to return. The old man was out there even now, in the dark, checking the soil in his pots by the light from his phone. "I don't know what I want," David admitted. "I just know that tonight, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. Like the music meant something beyond just pleasant background noise." Teresa sighed. "I'm not saying don't be an artist, David. I'm saying don't be a martyr. There's a difference." They talked for a few more minutes, Teresa updating him on his niece and nephew. Amara was struggling with math but excelling in soccer, and James had decided he wanted to be a paleontologist this week, which was at least better than last week when he'd wanted to be a professional video game player. Normal life, normal problems, normal joys. The kind of stability that felt both appealing and utterly foreign to David. After hanging up, he made himself instant ramen because it was cheap and quick, and he'd forgotten to eat anything except a granola bar before the gig. While the water boiled, he pulled out his laptop. The screen held on with electrical tape after he'd dropped it last month. He had an email from someone named J. Martinez with the subject line, "Tonight's performance questions." David's finger hovered over the delete button. He didn't need more complications, but curiosity won as it usually did. The email was short. "Mr. Sanders, I was at the Riverside Foundation Gala tonight. I'm an investigative journalist with the Riverside Tribune. Your song raised some questions I've been asking for months. Would you be willing to talk? Julia Martinez." David stared at the screen until his ramen got cold. Then he stared some more. The thing about David Sanders that most people didn't know, that he barely admitted to himself, was that he was deeply, fundamentally afraid. Not of performing, that was the easy part, the part where he could hide behind his guitar and his father's songs and the persona of the struggling artist. He was afraid of matching, of being seen, of saying something true and then having to live with the consequences. His father had taught him that fear in the same way he'd taught him chord progressions, not deliberately but through lived example. David had been 14 when his father had written a song about police brutality, inspired by a cousin's arrest that everyone in the family knew had been about skin color and nothing else. The song was powerful, angry, necessary. His father had performed it once, at a local venue, and the next week, he'd been pulled over 3 times in 4 days. Warnings, all of them. Nothing official. Just warnings. The message was clear. His father had never performed that song again. Had barely even played it at home. David had found the recording years later, on an old cassette tape in a box of his father's things after he'd died. Listening to it, hearing the passion and rage and fear all tangled together in his father's voice, had broken something in David's chest. Because his father had been brave enough to write the truth but not brave enough to keep singing it. And David understood why. There were bills to pay, a family to feed, a life to maintain. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. Now, sitting in his shabby apartment with cold ramen and an email from a journalist, David faced the same choice his father had faced. Speak and face consequences, or be silent and stay safe. He opened a new email and started typing, "Ms. Martinez, I'd be willing to talk, but I need you to understand. I'm just a musician. I sang a song. I don't actually know anything concrete about the foundation's finances." He reread it 3 times, each time the words looking more cowardly, more like a retreat. He deleted it and started again. "Ms. Martinez, yes, let's talk. When and where?" That was better. Short, direct, committed. He hit send before he could overthink it. The rest of the night passed in a blur of familiar routines. He practiced for an hour, running through the set list for a wedding gig he had coming up the following weekend. Nothing like tonight, just standard reception fare. Acoustic covers that would blend into the background of someone else's happiest day. He worked on a song he'd been writing for months, a melody that kept escaping him every time he thought he'd pinned it down. He cleaned his apartment, which mostly meant moving stacks of sheet music from one surface to another. At midnight, when the building had gone quiet except for the familiar sounds of pipes and creaking wood, David pulled out an old shoebox from the top of his closet. Inside were the cassette tapes his father had left behind, each one labeled in his father's precise handwriting, Riverside Sessions 1995, The Price of Giving Final Version, James's Songs for a Better World. James Sanders had believed that music could change things, that songs could wake people up and make them see injustice and move them to action. But James Sanders had also died at 53 from a heart attack that the doctor said was probably stress-related, leaving behind a family who loved him, a community who admired him, and a collection of beautiful, unheard music that had changed exactly nothing. David selected a tape at random and popped it into the old cassette player he kept around specifically for this purpose. His father's voice filled the room, younger than David remembered, singing about workers' rights and dignity and the mathematics of exploitation. The song was called Profit Margins, and it was about a factory that laid off 200 people to increase shareholder value. Listening to it now, David heard things he'd missed when he was younger. He heard his father's talent, yes, but also his father's exhaustion. The weariness of fighting battles that seemed unwinnable. The weight of caring about justice in a world designed to reward injustice. He fell asleep on the couch with his father's voice still playing, singing about a world that could be better if only people would listen, if only people would care, if only the music could somehow be enough. David's alarm went off at 6:30, the opening riff of Jimi Hendrix's Voodoo Child blasting from his phone. He'd chosen it years ago because it was impossible to sleep through, and he'd been late to too many morning gigs to trust himself with something gentler. The wedding gig wasn't until Saturday, but David had a routine. Tuesdays and Thursdays he gave guitar lessons to kids in the basement of Riverside Baptist Church, a volunteer program he'd started 3 years ago after the community center's music lessons had been cut. He didn't advertise it, didn't charge anything, just showed up with his guitar and whoever came. Usually between 5 and 8 kids, ages 7 to 15, all from families who couldn't afford private lessons. Some had instruments, cheap beginner's guitars bought at pawn shops or borrowed from relatives. Some didn't, and David rotated his own 2 guitars between them, teaching them the basics, drilling them on finger positions and chord changes until the patterns became muscle memory. The church basement smelled like must and old hymnals, and the fluorescent lights flickered in a way that probably violated some kind of electrical code. But Father O'Brien let David use the space for free as long as he didn't mind occasionally sharing it with Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and the Women's Quilting Circle. This morning, David was running late. He'd overslept by 20 minutes, startled awake by a dream where he was performing at Carnegie Hall, but all the seats were empty except for his father's ghost in the front row, shaking his head in disappointment. He threw on clothes that were clean enough, grabbed his guitar and his backup, and made it to the church with 3 minutes to spare. Esperanza was already there, sitting on the steps outside with her beaten-up Yamaha acoustic that she'd bought for $40 at a yard sale. She was 12, tiny for her age, with fierce eyes and a determination that reminded David of himself at that age, or maybe the version of himself he wished he'd been. "You're late," she said, not unkindly. "By 3 minutes. That's basically on time. My mom says if you're not early, you're late." "Your mom's right, but don't tell her I said that." Esperanza grinned and followed him inside. The basement was already set up, folding chairs in a semicircle, music stands salvaged from the church's defunct youth orchestra, a whiteboard where David wrote out chord progressions and music theory basics that most of his students ignored. Over the next 10 minutes, 5 more kids filtered in. Marcus Jr., who everyone called MJ, 11 years old and so tall he looked 14. Twin sisters, Kayla and Keisha, who'd started coming 2 months ago and had already progressed past some of the kids who'd been with David for years. A quiet 9-year-old named Thomas, who never spoke but played with a delicacy that suggested real talent. And Devin, 15, who'd been in and out of juvenile detention and came to lessons because it was court-mandated community service, but who David suspected actually loved the music even if he'd never admit it. "All right," David said, settling into his chair and pulling out his Gibson. "Who practiced their GCD progression?" Groans all around, which meant exactly no one. "Come on, people. We talked about this. You can't expect to get better if you don't practice." "My mom needed the living room for her Zumba workout videos," Kayla offered. "She says my playing stresses her out." "I forgot," MJ said with a shrug that was pure adolescent nonchalance. Esperanza at least looked guilty. "I practiced, but only for like 10 minutes, and I kept messing up the change from C to D." David nodded. This was familiar territory. Kids with busy lives, with parents working multiple jobs, with homes too small and loud for focused practice, with a million legitimate reasons why music couldn't be the priority it needed to be if you wanted to get good at it. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to run through the progression together, nice and slow, until everyone can make it all the way through without stopping. And then I'm going to teach you a song that uses those exact chords." "What song?" Devin asked, suspicious. He'd been burned before by teachers who promised cool music and then taught Kumbaya. David thought for a moment, then started playing the opening to 3 Little Birds by Bob Marley. Simple, catchy, meaningful. The kids' faces lit up with recognition. "For real?" MJ asked. "For real. But you have to nail the chord progression first. Perfectly. 3 times in a row." What followed was an hour of controlled chaos. Fingers fumbling on frets, strings buzzing from incorrect pressure, the occasional curse word quickly apologized for, and slowly, gradually, the messy noise coalescing into something resembling music. David moved between students, adjusting hand positions, demonstrating techniques, offering encouragement that was genuine because he remembered what it felt like to be learning, to have music feel both tantalizingly close and impossibly far away. Esperanza was struggling with the C chord, her small fingers unable to stretch comfortably across the frets. David showed her a simplified version, 2 fingers instead of 3, and watched her face transform when the chord rang out clearly for the first time. "I did it," she said, looking up at him with such pure joy that something in David's chest cracked open. "You did. Now do it again." By the end of the session, they'd made it through 3 Little Birds twice, messily but recognizably. The kids left with actual smiles, with a sense of accomplishment, with something beautiful they'd created together. David was packing up his guitars when Father O'Brien appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his cassock swishing around his ankles. He was in his 70s, Irish-American, with a face that had seen enough of the world to be compassionate and enough of humanity to be skeptical. "You're good with them," the priest said. "They're good kids. They are. But not many people would show up twice a week to teach them for free. Especially not when you're barely keeping your own head above water." David didn't ask how Father O'Brien knew about his finances. Churches knew everything, especially churches in neighborhoods like this where gossip was currency and community was survival. "Ms. Chun taught me for free," David said. "Seemed only right to pass it on. Patricia Chun was a saint, but even she accepted donations sometimes. Let people help her." "Are you about to ask me to accept help, Father?" "I'm about to tell you that pride is a sin, but martyrdom is worse. You can't pour from an empty cup." David zipped his guitar case, the sound sharp in the quiet basement. "I'm not a martyr." "No? Then why do you look like you're carrying the weight of the world every time I see you?" The question landed harder than it should have. David thought about Teresa's words from the night before, about the difference between being an artist and being a martyr. About his father, who'd worn his suffering like a badge of honor, who'd confused struggle with virtue. "I'm just trying to do the right thing," David said finally. Father O'Brien smiled, sad and knowing. "The right thing is usually the hardest thing, but it shouldn't destroy you. Remember that." After the lesson, David had exactly 1 hour before he needed to be across town for a lunch shift at Riverside Cafe, a local spot that hired him to play background music on Tuesdays and Thursdays from noon to 2. It paid better than most gigs, $15 an hour plus tips, and came with a free meal, which was sometimes the only decent food he ate all day. He stopped at his apartment to drop off his backup guitar and grab his work shirt. The cafe required all performers to wear black, which was fine because basically his entire wardrobe was black anyway. There was a message on his door, written on the back of a receipt in Teresa's handwriting. "Call me. Got you a real gig opportunity." David pocketed the note and headed out. The cafe was a 20-minute walk from his apartment, through the part of Riverside that tourists never saw, check cashing places and bodegas, murals on brick walls depicting local heroes and lost loved ones, corner stores with security cameras and bars on the windows. His neighborhood, for better or worse. The place he'd grown up, where everyone knew everyone, where you couldn't walk 3 blocks without someone calling your name. David Sanders. He turned to see Mrs. Chun, Patricia's mother, waving from across the street. She was 84, barely 5 feet tall, with a voice that could carry across 3 lanes of traffic. David waited for her to cross, timing the walk signal to match her careful shuffle. "I heard what you did," she said, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "At the gala, Lydia told me. I just played a song. You played truth. Patricia would have been proud. She always said you had something special, that you weren't afraid to say hard things." David thought about all the times he had been afraid, all the moments he'd chosen silence over truth. But Mrs. Chun was looking at him with such fierce pride that he couldn't contradict her. "I miss her," he said instead. "I miss the lessons, the program. Those kids I teach at the church. They're good kids, but they deserve better than what I can give them in a basement once a week." Mrs. Chun nodded. The foundation took something from this community when they shut down those programs. They took hope. They took beauty. But you, David, you're giving it back. Different, smaller maybe, but you're giving it back. She pressed something into his hand. A $20 bill, worn soft from circulation. "I can't. You can and you will. Buy strings for those guitars. Buy music books. Buy whatever you need to keep teaching those children." Patricia's life insurance finally came through, and this is what she would have wanted. David tried to argue, but Mrs. Chun had already turned and was shuffling away, done with the conversation on her own terms. He looked down at the $20, feeling the weight of it, the gift and the responsibility tangled together. The cafe was busy when he arrived, the lunch crowd already forming. Mario, the owner, waved him toward his usual corner. A small raised platform near the window where he could see the street and customers could ignore him while they ate their sandwiches and salads. "Good crowd today," Mario said. "Play them something nice. No protest music." David wondered if everyone in Riverside had already heard about last night. It seemed impossible, But this was a small town wearing the clothes of a small city, and gossip moved faster than anything. He set up quickly, tuning his guitar and running through his mental catalog of acceptable lunch music. James Taylor, John Denver, Simon and Garfunkel. Music that was pleasant and inoffensive, that enhanced the atmosphere without demanding attention. But as he started playing Carolina in My Mind, his thoughts drifted to the email from Julia Martinez, the journalist. She'd responded that morning, suggesting they meet tomorrow at a coffee shop in the historic district. David had agreed before he could think better of it, and now the meeting loomed in his mind like a storm on the horizon. What was he doing? He wasn't an investigator. He wasn't even particularly knowledgeable about nonprofit finance or charitable foundations. He was just a guitarist who'd sung his father's song at the wrong, or maybe right moment. A regular customer, an older man named Harold who came in every Tuesday for the roast beef sandwich, caught his eye and nodded appreciatively. Harold always left a $5 tip in the jar, always told David he had a gift, always asked when David was going to make it big. The question used to bother David, the assumption that making it big was the goal, that success could be measured in record deals and sold-out venues. But he'd made peace with it years ago. Harold meant well. Most people meant well. They just didn't understand that for David, success looked different. It looked like Esperanza learning the C chord. It looked like Devin showing up to lessons even when he didn't have to. It looked like the moment when a song connected, really connected, and you could see someone hear themselves in the music. During his break, Mario brought him a sandwich, turkey and avocado, David's favorite, and sat down across from him with a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been sitting on the burner since morning. "You okay?" Mario asked. "You seem distracted." "Just thinking. About last night?" "Yeah, I heard. My cousin's wife was at that gala. She said you basically called out the whole foundation in front of everyone." David took a bite of sandwich to avoid responding immediately. The avocado was perfectly ripe, the bread fresh. Mario ran a good place, treated his people well, paid fair wages even when it meant his own profit margins were razor thin. "I played a song my father wrote," David said finally. "About charity that's not really charity." Mario nodded slowly. "Your father was a smart man, principled. That doesn't always make life easier." "No, it doesn't. But it makes it worth living." Mario stood, his knees cracking with the movement. "Finish your sandwich. You've got another hour, and there's a couple in the corner who keep looking over here. I think they're hoping you'll play something romantic." The couple was young, early 20s maybe, holding hands across the table with the kind of intensity that suggested either a new relationship or one they were trying to save. David played "The Way You Look Tonight," then Something by the Beatles, then Can't Help Falling in Love. The girl rested her head on the boy's shoulder, and for those few minutes, the music did what it was supposed to do. Created a space for people to feel whatever they needed to feel. After his shift, David counted his tips. $18, which was decent for a Tuesday lunch crowd. Combined with the hourly rate and Mrs. Chen's 20, he'd made enough to cover this week's groceries and maybe put a little toward the rent he owed. His phone buzzed. "Teresa? Did you get my note? Call me." He stepped outside into the autumn chill and dialed his sister's number. "Finally," Teresa answered. "I've been trying to reach you all day. I had the church lessons, then the cafe gig. What's this about a real opportunity?" "Okay, so you know my coworker Janet? Her husband runs the Riverside Arts Festival, that big thing they do every spring in Riverside Park. Apparently, they're looking for local musicians for the opening night showcase, and when Janet heard your name come up in conversation, don't ask, everyone's talking about last night. She mentioned it to her husband. David, this could be huge. It's a real stage, a real audience, not just background music." David's stomach did something complicated. The Riverside Arts Festival was legitimate, the kind of event that drew crowds from across the state, that featured artists who actually made a living from their art. Getting a slot there could mean exposure, connections, maybe even bookings for other festivals. "What's the catch?" he asked. "Why does there have to be a catch?" "There's always a catch." Teresa sighed. "Fine. The catch is that they're looking for feel-good stories. Local artists who've overcome adversity, that kind of thing. Janet's husband, his name is Richard, by the way. He heard about your gig at the foundation, about your father's songs, and he thinks you'd be perfect. But David, you'd have to audition. And you'd have to be willing to talk about your background, your struggles. They want authentic, but they also want marketable. There it was. The catch. Not just play your music, but package your pain. Make your poverty palatable. Turn struggle into story, suffering into entertainment. I don't know, Teresa. I'm not asking you to lie or exaggerate. Just be yourself. Tell your truth. Isn't that what you were doing last night? Isn't that what Dad's songs were about? Dad's songs were about systemic injustice, not about making his personal struggles into a commodity. And what do you think would have happened if someone had offered Dad a real platform? A chance to reach thousands of people instead of dozens? You think he would have turned that down out of pride? David didn't have an answer. His father had died before facing that choice, before getting the opportunity to compromise or stand firm. It was easy to maintain your principles when they were never really tested. When's the audition? He asked. Next Wednesday, 11 a.m. at the festival offices. You'd have a 15-minute slot, 3 songs, plus a short interview about your background and artistic vision. Artistic vision, David repeated. I play guitar and sing songs that other people wrote, mostly. You write too. I've heard your stuff. And you have that whole catalog of Dad's music. David, this could be your chance to share his work with people, to give those songs the audience they deserve. That landed differently. Not David's opportunity, but his father's. A chance to give voice to all those unperformed songs, all that unheard truth. Okay, he said. I'll do it. Really? You'll actually do it? I said okay, didn't I? Teresa's squeal of excitement nearly deafened him. This is amazing. I'll tell Janet. She'll tell Richard. They'll get you on the schedule. Oh, David. This could change everything for you. After they hung up, David stood on the sidewalk outside the cafe, watching the afternoon foot traffic. People rushing to appointments, mothers pushing strollers, teenagers cutting class. The homeless man who always sat outside the bank with a sign that read veteran. Anything helps. God bless. David walked over and put 5 of his tip dollars in the man's cup. The man looked up. His name was Gerald, David had learned months ago, and nodded his thanks. That's kind of you, Gerald said. Most people just walk past. I know what it's like to be invisible. Gerald smiled, gap-toothed and weary. Nobody's invisible, young man. We're all just waiting for someone to really see us. That evening, David practiced for the audition even though it was a week away. He couldn't help himself. The opportunity felt too big to leave to chance, too important to approach casually. He ran through his father's catalog, pulling out songs he hadn't played in years, relearning lyrics he'd half forgotten, making decisions about which pieces would work for a festival crowd. The price of giving was obvious. It's what had started this whole thing. But he needed 2 more songs, and they had to tell a story, had to build on each other in a way that made sense. He settled on Riverside Rain, a gentle ballad his father had written about the town, about the river that ran through it, about the people who stayed when the factories closed and the opportunities dried up. It was beautiful and melancholic, full of love for a place that didn't always love you back. For the 3rd song, he chose one of his own. Something he'd written 6 months ago after a particularly hard day. It was called The Things We Carry, and it was about inherited trauma and inherited dreams, about the weight of other people's expectations and the courage it took to forge your own path. He'd never performed it for anyone except Teresa, who'd cried and told him it was the best thing he'd ever written. He was in the middle of the 2nd verse when someone knocked on his door. David checked his phone, almost 9 p.m. late for visitors. Through the peephole, he saw Marcus from the community center. Marcus? What are you doing here? The older man looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Can I come in? I need to talk to you about something. David stepped aside, and Marcus entered. His eyes taking in the small apartment with its second-hand furniture and walls covered in music posters and framed photographs. The biggest photo was of David's father, taken when he was about David's age, holding the Gibson and grinning at whoever was behind the camera. Your daddy was a good man, Marcus said. looking at the photo. Stubborn but good. That seems to be the consensus. Marcus sat down on the futon, his joints creaking. I came because Dorothy Keene asked me to. She wants you to know she's serious about investigating the foundation. She's been making calls, asking questions, and apparently, she's not the only one who's been wondering where the money goes. David set his guitar down carefully. Why are you telling me this? Because Ms. Keene wants your help. And because I think you should know what you're getting into before you decide whether to give it. Marcus pulled out a folder from inside his jacket, worn manila with coffee stains on one corner. I've been at that community center for 42 years. I've seen a lot of things. Most of it good, some of it less so. And for the last 5 years, something's been off. He opened the folder, revealing printouts of financial documents, spreadsheets, what looked like internal memos. David recognized Vanessa Cromwell's name on several of them. Where did you get these? David asked. Let's just say the janitor has access to places other people forget about. Trash cans. Unlocked offices at night. File cabinets that don't close all the way. Marcus's expression was grim. I didn't go looking for this stuff, David. I just started noticing things. Programs getting cut while the foundation's revenue kept growing. Staff getting let go while the executive salaries went up. And then there's this. He pulled out a document and pointed to a line item. Administrative overhead, $347,000. That's for 1 year, Marcus said. Last year, the foundation raised about $600,000 total, and more than half of it went to administrative overhead. You know what that means in plain English? It means salaries, office expenses, the gala itself. Meanwhile, the actual programs, the music lessons, the art classes, the after-school programs, they got $89,000. Total. For the whole year. David felt sick. That can't be legal. It's legal enough. Nonprofits are allowed to have operating expenses. But there's supposed to be oversight, accountability. The board is supposed to review this stuff and ask questions. But from what Ms. Keene has been finding out, nobody's asked questions in years. They just rubber stamp whatever Vanessa Cromwell puts in front of them. Why are you showing me this? Why not just give it to Ms. Keene? I did give it to her, but she thinks you should see it too. Says you have a stake in this, since your song is what opened the door. And honestly, David, I think she's right. This is about more than just numbers on a page. It's about kids like Esperanza and MJ who deserve the same chances you got, the same chances Ms. Chun gave you. It's about your daddy's legacy, about whether his music and his beliefs meant anything. David picked up the financial documents, scanning the numbers that Marcus had highlighted in yellow. Salaries for positions that seemed redundant. Event expenses that seemed inflated. Grant money that was supposed to go to programs, but somehow got redirected to capacity building and infrastructure development. What does Ms. Keene want from me? He asked. She wants you to meet with that journalist, Julia Martinez. Tell her what you know, what you saw, what made you sing that song. Ms. Keene thinks if we can get the press involved, if we can make enough noise, maybe we can force the board to actually look at what's been happening. Maybe we can save what's left of the foundation before it's too late. And if Vanessa Cromwell comes after me? If I get blacklisted from every venue in Riverside? Marcus stood, his hand on David's shoulder. Then you'll know you scared someone who needed scaring. Look, I'm not going to tell you this is risk-free. Your daddy took risks and they cost him. But they also meant something. The people he sang for, the truths he told, they mattered. They still matter. And now you have a choice about whether you're going to let that legacy die quiet or whether you're going to make some noise of your own. After Marcus left, David sat with the folder for a long time, reading through the documents, seeing the pattern of exploitation dressed up in the language of charity. He thought about Esperanza and her C-chord, about the kids at the church who came week after week with hope in their eyes. He thought about the girl crying in the bathroom at the gala, having to perform her trauma for pocket change. He thought about his father's unperformed songs and his own fear of being seen. At midnight, he opened his laptop and wrote an email to Julia Martinez. I have information you're going to want to see. When can we meet? Julia Martinez arrives precisely on time, professional and direct. When David asks if he needs a lawyer, her response is equally pointed. Do you think you need a lawyer? He doesn't know yet, but he agrees to let her record their conversation. David explains his connection to the foundation, how Patricia Chen's free music lessons saved him as a teenager, how the program was cut 5 years ago, and how playing at their recent gala made him realize something was deeply wrong. His father's song, The Price of Giving, critiqued performative charity. Organizations that give not to help but to gain credit, tax deductions, and good feelings without actually changing the systems creating the need for charity. When Julia asks what made him think this applied specifically to the Riverside Foundation, David pulls out the folder Marcus had given him. 5 years of financial documents showing the devastating ratio of program spending to administrative costs. Julia's demeanor shifts from curious to intensely focused as she reviews the papers. She needs to verify the source, but David can't reveal that Marcus, the foundation's janitor, risked his job to provide the evidence. Julia assures him she can cross-reference with public filings and IRS reports. What David doesn't know is that Julia has been investigating the foundation for 3 months, ever since her friend's daughter received a scholarship that was a quarter of what was advertised. The foundation claimed to give 4 full scholarships of $5,000 each, but actually divided that amount among 4 recipients. Technically legal, but deliberately misleading to donors. Julia shows David her research. Programs listed on the website that haven't been offered in years, classes with no actual participants, comprehensive mission statements describing services that don't exist. The question burning at the center of her investigation is simple. Where is the money going? They talk for over an hour, connecting dots between Marcus's financial evidence and Julia's documentation of phantom programs. But Julia warns David about consequences. Vanessa Cromwell, the foundation's executive director, sits on multiple boards, has relationships with local politicians and wealthy donors. Whistleblowers often suffer more than those committing corruption, at least initially. There could be legal threats, reputation attacks, loss of livelihood. David thinks about his precarious financial situation, about barely keeping himself afloat with teaching gigs and cafe performances. He thinks about his girlfriend Teresa's concerns about stability. But he also thinks about his father, who chose safety over truth and lived with that regret until it consumed him from the inside. Do what you need to do, David tells Julia. Write the story. 3 days pass in a surreal blur of normalcy. David continues teaching, performing, and practicing for an upcoming festival audition that could change his career. Julia works to verify sources and build an airtight case for Sunday's publication. Then Dorothy Keene calls. David recognizes the name. She's one of the foundation's board members, someone he'd noticed at the gala. She wants to meet at her home in Riverside Heights, the neighborhood where houses have names instead of numbers and gates guard the entrance. Standing before her Georgian mansion, David feels completely out of place. But Dorothy Keene herself answers the door, dressed casually, her silver hair loose, greeting him with genuine warmth that transforms her elegant features. Inside her book-filled study, over tea, Dorothy tells David a story that recontextualizes everything. 40 years ago, she and her husband Robert founded the Riverside Foundation. Robert had made his fortune ethically in manufacturing, treating workers well and paying fair wages. When he died, he left a substantial portion of his estate to ensure every child in Riverside could access the arts regardless of their family's financial situation. For 20 years, Dorothy believes they succeeded. But as she aged and her health became unreliable, she stepped back from day-to-day operations. That was her mistake. Vanessa Cromwell joined as executive director 8 years ago with impressive credentials and apparent passion. Gradually, imperceptibly, programs were cut under the guise of streamlining and efficient resource use. The board, including Dorothy, trusted Vanessa's expertise and stopped asking hard questions. David's song at the gala was Dorothy's wake-up call. She went home and started examining financial reports she'd been rubber-stamping for years. She called other board members and realized none of them actually knew where the money was going anymore. What she discovered broke her heart. The foundation had become exactly what her husband would have hated. An organization that exists primarily to perpetuate itself, paying executives well while programs wither, raising money ostensibly for children but spending it on galas and overhead and salaries. "We've betrayed Robert's vision," Dorothy says, her voice breaking. "And worse, we've betrayed this community." She pulls out a document, her resignation from the board, effective immediately, along with a demand for a full independent audit of the foundation's finances for the past decade. If there's been fraud or misappropriation, she wants it exposed. If it's simply mismanagement and mission drift, she wants that exposed too. But she can't do it alone. At 83, she'll be dismissed as confused or bitter. David is young, from the community with credibility. If he speaks out and shares his father's legacy, people will listen. David tells her about Julia's upcoming article. Dorothy smiles. She already gave Julia an on-record interview. But a newspaper article is just the beginning. Real change requires sustained pressure, public outcry, people demanding accountability. David thinks about every practical reason to refuse. His audition is next Wednesday. He has bills to pay and a precarious existence. Teresa will think he's insane. Every sensible part of him screams to walk away. But he thinks about Patricia Chun teaching him chords in a dusty basement. About his father's songs gathering dust. About students like Esperanza and MJ who deserve better than broken promises. "Okay," he says, "I'll help." Sunday morning, Julia's article explodes across Riverside like a detonation. The headline, "Where does the money go?" Riverside Foundation's arts programs exist on paper only. The piece is thorough and devastating. Julia tracked down former employees who spoke anonymously about being pressured to inflate participation numbers. She found families promised scholarships that turned out to be fractions of what was advertised. She interviewed local artists who applied for grants that supposedly existed but seemed impossible to receive. She included the financial analysis showing less than 20% of the annual budget went to actual programs. Vanessa Cromwell's response is defensive and jargon-filled, talking about operational efficiency and sustainable nonprofit management. She denies wrongdoing and suggests criticism of the foundation is really criticism of hard work being done to help the community. David's phone starts ringing before he finishes reading. Teresa is first, asking if he's lost his mind. The article essentially names him as the catalyst. Vanessa Cromwell has connections with half the venue owners in Riverside. He could be blacklisted. "Then I'll play on street corners," David responds. Teresa reminds him about the festival audition. What if they've seen the article? What if they decide he's too controversial? Marcus calls next, warning that Vanessa's assistant contacted him about an internal investigation into who leaked the documents. Marcus is 67 and eligible for retirement, ready to face consequences. But he warns David that the foundation might sue for defamation. Then come calls of support. Father O'Brien offering prayer, Mario from the cafe expressing pride, even Patricia Chun somehow getting his number to say his father would be proud. And then Richard Chun from the Riverside Arts Festival calls. David braces for cancellation. Instead, Richard offers him the opening night main stage. A 45-minute set, prime time, no audition necessary. David is stunned. This is the opposite of blacklisting. Richard explains that the festival celebrates authentic artistic voices, especially those speaking truth about their community. What David did at the gala, what he's doing now, that's exactly what they want to showcase. Use that platform however you see fit, Richard tells him. Tell your truth. Sing your father's songs. That's what art is supposed to do. Comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Online, the article is exploding. Hundreds of tweets share stories of being turned away from foundation programs or misled about scholarships. Local politicians call for investigations. Regional news outlets pick up the story. People share their experiences. Scholarship applications that disappeared into silence, promised art supplies that never materialized, donations given in good faith that vanished into administrative overhead. That evening, Dorothy convenes a meeting at her house with Julia, Marcus, and affected community members. They form a coalition to attend the foundation's Thursday board meeting and demand accountability. They'll maintain media pressure and work either to reform the foundation or create a new organization truly serving community needs. This won't be easy, Dorothy warns. Vanessa has powerful friends. The board may close ranks. We could fight for years and see no change. Or we could fight for months and win, Marcus replies. Either way, at least we fought. David looks around at these unlikely allies. An elderly philanthropist, a journalist, a janitor, community members who believe in accountability. He thinks about his father, who wrote songs about justice but never lived to see them create change. I'm in, David says. Whatever it takes. The week moves like a fever dream. David practices, teaches, and somehow finds himself at the center of a community movement he never intended to start. At his Tuesday cafe gig, people approach him during breaks. Some thank him. Others share stories of disappointment with the foundation. One woman with paint-stained fingers, eyes wet with tears, tells him she taught art classes through the foundation 15 years ago before being let go during restructuring. They told us there wasn't funding, she says. But I saw the gala photos every year. The champagne, the decorations. The money was there. It just wasn't for us. Mario hands David an envelope with his payment. Inside is $200 cash and a note. For the kids at the church. Buy them real guitars. Wednesday evening, David stands backstage at the Riverside Arts Festival, terrified. The main stage is bigger than anything he's played before. Professional sound system, lighting rig, hundreds of people spreading blankets on the grass. Richard Chen finds him. Nervous. Terrified. Good. That means you care. David sees Teresa in the third row with her kids. Patricia Chen with elderly women who probably knew his father. Marcus standing at the back with Dorothy. Father O'Brien. His students from the church. Esperanza clutching her guitar like a talisman. The lights blind him momentarily. Then he begins. My name is David Sanders. I want to tell you a story about music and justice, and the difference between charity and giving a damn. He tells them about his father, a musician who wrote songs about things that mattered but kept some quiet, afraid of consequences. About the box of recordings nobody ever heard. He plays The Price of Giving. And this time, in this place, the words land differently. People recognize themselves in the lyrics, see their community's story in the melody. When he reaches the verse about children too hungry to swing, someone sobs. Between songs, David talks. About Patricia Chen's lessons, about Marcus holding doors in the cold, about Esperanza learning the C chord, about the scholarship student crying in the bathroom, performing trauma for pocket change, about Dorothy having the courage to demand answers from an organization she helped build. Tomorrow night, there's a Riverside Foundation board meeting at the community center, he tells the crowd. It's open to the public. If you care about where your donations go, if you want arts programs that actually serve kids, show up, ask questions, demand accountability. For his final song, he performs his own composition about inherited dreams and forging new paths. His voice cracks on the bridge, but he pushes through. Backstage afterward, Teresa hugs him tight without words. That says everything. Thursday evening, the community center's meeting room is packed beyond capacity. Fire codes be damned. People line the walls, sit on the floor, crowd the doorway. At least 200 people, maybe more. The board sits at a table in front. Vanessa Cromwell at the center, her expression carved from ice. Dorothy has returned for this meeting, taking her seat with quiet dignity. The meeting begins with procedural matters, minutes, financial reports in dry language designed to induce sleep. Vanessa tries to maintain control, rushing through agenda items, but the crowd is restless. Finally, public comment. Dorothy speaks first about her husband's vision and how the foundation has lost its way, calling for an independent audit. The room erupts in applause. One by one, people share their stories. The mother whose daughter never received promised supplies. The teenager turned away from supposedly available programs. The former employee pressured to fabricate participation numbers. The donor whose designated gift for music scholarships disappeared into a barely existing program. David speaks last, talking about his father, about legacy, about the responsibility that comes with being trusted with other people's hope and money, about the kids at the church who deserve better than what this foundation promised but failed to deliver. "I'm not here to destroy anything," he says. "I'm here because I believe in what this foundation was supposed to be, and I think we can make it that again. But only if we're honest about where we are now." The vote comes quickly. 3 board members had already resigned, unwilling to face scrutiny. Of the remaining 7, 5 vote to approve an independent audit. Vanessa Cromwell, furious but defeated, is first to leave. Outside in the November cold, Dorothy finds David and thanks him. "I didn't do much, just sang a song." "You did exactly enough. You asked a question nobody else was asking. You used your voice when silence would have been easier." She hands him a business card and asks him to consider joining the board once the audit is complete. The foundation will need new leadership. "I'm just a musician," David protests. "You're a musician who understands the value of what we're supposed to protect." 3 months later, David stands on the stage at the Riverside Community Center, the same stage where this began but transformed. The room fills with students and parents for the relaunch of the foundation's music program, now actually funded, actually real. The independent audit found exactly what everyone suspected. Years of mismanagement, inflated administrative costs, programs existing only on paper. Vanessa Cromwell resigned. Several board members followed. The organization is being rebuilt with Dorothy as interim director and a new board including David, Marcus, and community members chosen for commitment rather than connections. The festival performance led to more gigs at venues wanting his voice, his truth, his father's songs. He's recording an album of his father's music with local musicians who believe in the project. Money is still tight, but different, tight because he's investing in things that matter. Esperanza sits in the front row with a new guitar, one of 10 purchased with Mario's donation and funds from community members who stepped up after the scandal. She plays a simple chord progression, her face concentrated and joyful. David picks up his Gibson and plays along. Other students join in, a messy, beautiful cacophony of learning and trying and not giving up. Patricia Chun would have loved this. His father would have loved this. Marcus approaches after class. He's officially retired from janitorial work but now volunteers with the foundation's programs, mentoring students, maintaining the building through decades of accumulated knowledge. "Your daddy would be proud," Marcus says. "You took his songs and made them do what he always hoped they would, wake people up." David reflects on the difference between staying silent to stay safe and speaking up because silence is its own betrayal. "That's the thing about justice," Marcus replies. "It doesn't usually look like something special in the moment. It looks like one person deciding they've had enough, and then another person, and another, until there's enough people who've had enough that things have to change." That night, David returns to his still shabby third-floor apartment. He pulls out his father's cassette tapes and plays along, learning melodies, adding harmonies. Tomorrow he'll teach these songs to students. Next week, he'll perform them at a fundraiser. Next month, they'll be recorded, preserved, shared. His father believed music could change the world. David learned something slightly different. Music couldn't change the world alone, but it could change the people who changed the world. It could wake them up, remind them of what mattered, give them courage to ask questions and demand answers. Teresa calls to check in, inviting him to Sunday dinner. Her daughter has been practicing a song he taught her. After hanging up, David stands at his window, watching Mr. Kowalski tend his container garden in the cold, having faith in seeds not yet planted. David understands now the patience required for real change, the faith that small actions accumulate into something larger. He sang a song. Dorothy asked questions. Julia investigated. Marcus provided evidence. The community showed up. Together, they started something that would outlive any of them individually. His guitar sits in its case by the door, ready for tomorrow's lessons, next week's performance, all the songs yet to be sung. David touches the worn wood, feeling the scars his grandfather and father left, adding his own to the constellation. They'd called it charity, the foundation, the gala, the performance that was supposed to be pleasant and forgettable. But David called it something else, something truer. He called it the beginning of justice. And justice, unlike charity, demanded that you keep showing up long after the good feelings faded. Keep fighting long after it stopped being easy. Keep singing long after the applause died down. David was ready for that. His father's songs had waited decades to be heard. He could be patient a little longer. If this story resonated with you, if David's journey reminded you that one voice speaking truth can spark real change, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Join us for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about the courage it takes to stand up when it's easier to stay quiet, and about the power of community to demand better from institutions that claim to serve them. Subscribe today and be part of the conversation about justice, accountability, and the difference between charity and truly giving a damn.